You know, if you really like this movie, you can say it really rocked. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another overdue entry in my Thor review series, leading up to my review of Thor Love and Thunder. Today we're going to discuss Thor Ragnarok. So before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content like Marvel reviews on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about Thor Ragnarok. This once again sees Chris Hemsworth reprise his role as Thor. Imprisoned on the planet Sakaar, Thor must race against time to return to Asgard and stop Ragnarok, the destruction of his world at the hands of the powerful and ruthless villain Hela, played by Cate Blanchett. So as I've done previously with my reviews of older films, this will get into spoilers. So if you haven't seen Thor Ragnarok by now and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But now that you've been warned, here we go. Taika Waititi takes over as director, with this being the 5th film in Marvel's Phase 3 and the 17th MCU film overall. And this sees a radical shift in the direction of this character, and one that I personally view is for the better. While Thor always had some sprinkles of humor thrown into each of his films and his other appearances within the MCU, the general tone of his movies and his other appearances was that he was more of this self-serious Shakespearean character, with all the Asgardians speaking in these grand proclamations and making these big speeches. However, this sees him shift more in the direction of almost completely comedic. Now, it doesn't lose sight of the fact that he's still a noble hero who cares for others, with his relationship still being a big thing that motivates him, but that lovable dolt energy that we only got sometimes in his earlier appearances gets leaned into considerably more here. He wants to do the right thing, but he generally doesn't have a plan whenever he tries to take on more of a leadership role, and he tends to wing it, though he'll also play things off in a very nonchalant, casual way, which still speaks to his previous characterization of being headstrong. It's just here, it's utilized to give us more gags and one-liners, as opposed to just this very dry Shakespearean bickering we're used to seeing in the first Thor or The Dark World. And this characterization of Thor sets him down a brand new path that retones him as a whole. As I said, there were always bits of comedy in there, but this also sees movies like Avengers Infinity War and Endgame take a cue from this new characterization, where it leaned into his more comedic aspects, and even Thor's appearance in What If also took a similar approach. And despite this path also causing the franchise to drop several characters, in particular losing Jane and her colleagues as well as the Warriors 3 among others, this was seen as a refreshing new take on the character, and it's one that honestly I vastly prefer to anything we ever got from him. And this was such a great way to kick off this new take on the character, because I absolutely love this movie, and I always have a big smile on my face every time I throw it on. It's easily one of the MCU movies I've seen the most times, and it's such a much needed breath of fresh air, and one that, while it still plays a little into your typical MCU-isms, has more of a distinct feel to it. Like, even though he didn't write the movie, considering how off-kilter and weird the movie can feel at times, with a lot of quirky characters and deadpan line deliveries, this feels distinctly like a Taika Waititi movie. It might not be him completely left to his own devices, but it still feels very much like a Taika Waititi movie as it is an MCU movie, so that made me happy. Now, not that Thor himself was a bad character prior to this movie, even if Chris Hemsworth said he was starting to get bored with him before this, but this new characterization certainly plays much more into Hemsworth's strengths. Not that he's a bad dramatic actor by any means, he's had quite a few solid dramatic roles, and even the times Thor is required to be emotional in other MCU films, I think he does a fine job tapping into that, but he is absolute gold as a comedic actor. Waititi has said a lot of the jokes here were improvised. Now, I don't know which ones exactly were, but if any of them were Hemsworth's lines, I mean, the man just has a natural talent, honestly, because he was very, very funny here. And even if he didn't improvise a lot of his jokes, his timing is just rock solid, and combined with that very natural charisma he has to him, it makes Thor a much more endearing protagonist than what we've ever gotten from him before. And to be clear, even though this goes considerably heavy on the jokes, Thor still has a compelling arc all throughout this. Now, it might not be the absolute most profound thing we've ever got, but it still shows him going on this emotional journey, especially when it comes to his self-realization, as well as what Asgard, his home, truly means to him. Because we see him lose a lot here. He already lost his mother in the previous film, and here he loses his father Odin, played again by Anthony Hopkins. The Warriors 3 also die, he loses an eye, his hammer gets destroyed, and by the end of the movie, the titular Ragnarok event that he thought he could prevent winds up happening, which results in the destruction of Asgard. Now, we don't see him stew in some of this as much as the film probably could have done, which I know was something some people were complaining about. Like, when it comes to the Warriors 3 in particular, two of them probably get less than 30 seconds of screen time before being killed off. We don't even see him react to finding that news out, despite them being his best friends and main characters of the previous two movies. Like, they move on from that pretty quickly without it even being brought up to Thor eventually. So I get where that criticism comes from, but overall, it's not like Thor doesn't have any sort of sense of self-reflection on what's happened to him as a whole in this movie. He does grow by the end of this, because part of this focuses on him realizing that his power and his strength comes from within him, and he's not defined by his hammer, even if that hammer was a handy weapon in the past. And even though he does lose his physical home, the fact he still has a lot of his people with him, that's what's most important, as he even says by the end that Asgard isn't a place but a people. And I mean, despite the fact that he's saying this as his home is being desecrated by the monster Searcher, played by Clancy Brown, it's still a nice message thrown in there that it's our relationships that help define us and are what's most important. And that's something I think can go a long way. Again, given the tone of the movie, I know it's not done in such a way where it's presented as this hugely profound, overly sentimental moment that we stay on for like 5 to 10 minutes or anything, but it's presented in such a way where it still hits just the right amount of optimistic notes that it allows this message to resonate. Though otherwise, this film is an absolute blast. While most of the MCU is known for having its little twinges of humor, as I said, this is one of the few where it's a full-on comedy. And even though Waititi himself didn't write this, as I said, due to a number of the jokes being improvised, you can still feel a lot of his personal style of humor thrown in there. And of course, Waititi himself also appears here as the rock warrior Korg, who he plays up as very soft-spoken despite being a very large, hulking figure with a very deadpan sense of humor that made for some fun exchanges. I mean, I especially liked whenever he just led things off with, "Hey man," and he'd come up with this very simplistic plan. He didn't even say anything inherently funny, it's just the delivery, especially in relation to the situation at hand where he's saying this, would make these moments so much fun. But I can go on all day about this film's sense of humor, which is definitely one of, if not the main reason I enjoyed this as much as I did. But there are plenty of other reasons I thought this was great. For one thing, this is easily one of the most visually striking MCU movies. Now, the MCU is noted for having maybe a little bit of a darker color palette in general, but this is one of the brightest and most colorful of their movies, as the film leans much more heavily into the universe's cosmic side and turns the Thor franchise into a true space epic, with the film half taking place on Asgard and the other on the planet Sakaar, while only some of it takes place on Earth. Where, by the way, we do get a pretty hilarious Doctor Strange cameo. That was also one of my favorite scenes. But all this looked absolutely fantastic. The visual effects were solid, the imagery is all very distinct, and all the scenery just pops right out at you. Even during its darker moments, it felt like there was a lot of nice visual flair thrown in there, with each of the action scenes in particular feeling pretty memorable. Now, I don't know if I necessarily call these some of the absolute best MCU fight scenes ever, but a few of them are certainly up there. Unlike the ones in the first two Thor movies, they actually felt a little creative, usually for some of their comedic undertones, like the gladiator fight or the very quick get help scene, or because of something else on a technical level that elevated things. Like, the use of the Immigrant song really went a long way in making both the opening fight with Searcher and the final fight as memorable as they were. Also, speaking of the gladiator scenes, as this is when we first see the Hulk, this is probably one of the most fun uses of the Hulk, with Mark Ruffalo once more returning into the role. And it does draw some influences from the famous Planet Hulk storyline in the comics. Now, I wouldn't say this is necessarily the hands-down best interpretation of the character, but it's definitely one of the funniest, as we even get to see the Hulk himself actually talk and carry on conversations with Thor, as he's actually suppressed the Banner side of him for a couple of years and learned to get by on his own. But this does begin to cause a little bit of a noteworthy inner fight between the Banner personality and the Hulk personality, which is something we'd go on to explore in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, as Banner begins wrestling with who he truly is and what defines him, similar to what Thor goes through in these three movies. Now, this is probably the instance where the actual back and forth between Banner and Hulk is least explored, as we get more of that in Infinity War, but at the very least, this exploration did make for some fun moments, including Thor making very similar remarks about both Banner and Hulk to each other, where he'll insult Banner to Hulk and vice versa. Plus, Mark Ruffalo was just great as always. Though with this movie, we also get one of the best additions to this franchise, that being Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie, who starts off as a scrapper working for the ruler of Sakaar, the Grandmaster, played by a hilarious Jeff Goldblum, who, by the way, also steals the show with a lot of his Jeff Goldblumisms. But Valkyrie then eventually teams up with Thor once he discovers she's one of the last of her people due to them all being killed by Hela, who's his sister, which gives both of them a personal stake in this fight. So she gets some great moments of being a badass here, while also having a very sarcastic personality that makes her a great foil for the incredibly goofy Thor, who she does get to put in his place a few times early on. And you can see Tessa Thompson was having a lot of fun with the role, and she brought such a great energy to each of her scenes. So even beyond her appearances in the Thor movies, I really hope we do get to see more of her within the entire MCU. Then we get to the movie's villains. So this time, Loki, played again by Tom Hiddleston, is not so much of the villain, and he works more as an anti-hero here. He and Thor will go from being at odds with each other at various points to then working together based on whatever is more convenient for him. He winds up siding with Thor for the final act and stays that way through the end, but it'll be unpredictable beforehand what he does. Though, again, it does lead to some solid moments of the two going at it. And it should go without saying, Tom Hiddleston, once again, is great as the character, and he really gets to live up to his name, God of Mischief, here. And while he always had bits of sarcasm to him in his previous appearances, he gets to let loose a little more here. Though our actual main villain this time, as said at the top of this review, is Thor's sister Hela, who appears once Odin dies, which frees her from a prison he had her in. Now, I enjoyed Hela overall, but she's an interesting villain within the larger scope of MCU villains, as I don't know if I necessarily call her one of the most compelling MCU villains, as she has pretty simplistic motivations. She's basically just pure evil and she wants to rule over Asgard. As soon as she comes into the picture, she picks up where she left off so many years ago and just starts wreaking havoc. But that's about all there really is to her character. So it does lean into this ongoing issue that the MCU has of not always having the most complex, well-written villains. However, unlike the Dark Elves in the first Thor or Malekith from the Dark World, Hela is still a much more memorable villain simply because of Cate Blanchett's scene-chewing performance. I mean, don't get me wrong, the amount of destruction she causes does leave a mark. The fact she kills 2 of the Warriors 3 within seconds of arriving is definitely something I won't forget. But the fact that Blanchett really plays this role like this cackling witch who absolutely just revels in being as evil and vindictive as she is also leaves quite an impression. She's allowed to have so much fun with this role, going big each time we see her, and for that alone, that makes her one of the better MCU villains, even if there's not much to her characterization otherwise. And one last thing, I did also like Karl Urban as Scourge, an Asgardian who reluctantly joins Hela as a way of saving himself when she first arrives. And you can see he second guesses that decision all throughout the film, as he has this one giant crisis of conscience until he turns on her towards the very end. Now, Urban clearly had fun with the role, and like with everyone else, he gets a few good comedic bits. He's one who really doesn't turn in a bad performance, and I do like how his inner struggle was consistently conveyed just through his facial expressions more than anything. Though maybe I would have liked just a little more with him. It's too bad we didn't get him in a previous movie already, considering he's already established to be someone who already knew Thor, even if Thor himself doesn't remember him. I think that way it would have made his turn to join Hela a little more impactful, but as it stands, he was still good with what he was given to do, and I enjoyed him. Thor Ragnarok is a ton of fun and easily the best this character's ever been, with this being a full-on superhero comedy that brings a lot of laughs. While that does lead to the film, maybe not always leaning into its more emotional side as often as it could have, and it doesn't get to fully develop aspects of its villain, it's still a consistently sharp film. It's got a great sense of humor, a lot of eye-popping visuals, a brilliantly utilized cast, and some stylish direction by Taika Waititi, making this a much-needed reinvention of Thor and an overall excellent superhero movie. Thor Ragnarok gets a 9.5 out of 10. So stay tuned, as up next will be my review of the newest film, Thor Love and Thunder. But in the meantime, let me know, did you see Thor Ragnarok, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this your favorite of the Thor movies, or do you prefer the more serious films? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.